And we have a very important guest to join us now, a friend and colleague, and Rita McGrath, who is the world's #1 strategist with us today, and we're honored that she is sharing her time with us. She's the #2 management thinker in the world, according to. So we are privileged to have someone with this background. She's a professor at Columbia, and she has a whole array of activities in management and leadership and she can tell us about some of those. But I'd asked her to talk today about something that builds actually on what Joe was talking about, and that is the permissionless corporation. She has written this brilliant article earlier this year in the Harvard Business Review about the permissionless corporation, and what Joe was talking about was exactly that, the corporation where the employees appear to be totally permissionless. They are enabled both with information and authorization to make expenditures, do things, stop this, start that, vote on whether things should happen. And so I asked Rita to sit in on that conversation, and I hope she was able, and she did. And so we're a bit short of time, Rita. We have to stop at the 3:15 as we have the CEO of Hyatt, who only has this 45-minute segment, so I'm sorry about that. But if you could share with us, and I hope this will be one of many conversations we have about this. So if you could just lead off by what is the permissionless corporation about that? And what was your reaction to what you heard from Joe in this last session?
Oh, I think Joe's work is inspiring. Hopefully you can hear me, yes? Yep.
Sorry.
You can hear me all right, Steve?
Joe is no longer with us, no.
Oh, okay. Anyway, I thought it was inspiring and very much along the lines of what I've been looking at. So the idea behind permissionless corporations, to layer on what Joe said, is that you can use technology to replace what managers used to do. And so I did prepare a couple of slides. I don't know if you'd like me to show them.
Yeah, great.
Just to kind of sort of, let me see here. Right.
Yeah.
Let's see.
My favorite book.
There you go. So hopefully you can see that. So the idea really is, we're in this mode where we really are in an innovation arms race. And what that means is that competitive advantages, as we've classically understood them, are getting shorter. And if you think about strategy, right, the world of strategy, we kind of inherited it from industrial economics, which makes these two assumptions. The first is that industries exist, and the second is that the state of normal things is equilibrium. And I would argue that, Tesla and other companies, I'm not sure there's other companies like it, but Tesla and other leading companies are really demonstrating that industries are an artifact, we made them up, and that the normal state of things is really much more about change and progress than it is about equilibrium. And this leads us to what I call discovery-driven leadership. This is very similar to what you've written about a lot, Steve, which is really going from this world of precision and quality and detail to this world that's much more experimental and much more oriented towards learning as fast as possible. And so this is the one that I kind of wanted to get to in terms of what are the specific practices that I see in these high velocity permissionless organizations. And so I would say the first idea is that technology is really replacing management in many ways. So what you heard Joe talk about was these justice boards, that are basically saying, let's use the law of 2 feet, go where you can add the most value, and you can decide where you need to be working. A second thing is these, in between computer programs, you have what they call application programming interfaces. So, your bank and your insurance company don't have to rewrite their systems to be able to share information because there's this layer in between called an application programming interface, or APIs. And I think what Joe's talking about is an API-like system that works between human groups. So you're not having to sit down in a coordination meeting and spend hours figuring out who's supposed to do what or who's going to reprioritize, because the system is orchestrated in such a way that it does it for you. So we're starting to see the emergence of those. Another thing is single-threaded teams, and Joe didn't dwell on this that much, but the idea that when you're working on something, let's call it a bottleneck in the Tesla system, that's all you're working on. You're not task switching and jumping from topic to topic to topic all day long. That's what you're doing that minute, that hour, that day. So it's single thread is what they call it at Amazon. You're working modularly. So you're taking these big, giant things and breaking them down into replicable modules so that as you're building each module, you learn, right? You're embedding learning in your system. And finally, you're working in parallel. You're not doing things in sequence with these long waterfall modules. You're working in a way that allows you to parallel process. And I think those are some of the things that I've identified as being quite key to these permissionless organizational structures.
Yeah, and I think it's a really exciting article and a exciting concept. And but a couple of things that came out of Joe's talk that I didn't see in your list of 5 things there or in the article, which would be, first of all, the goal of Tesla is, well, first of all, they have this sort of galactic mission to save the human race. And as well as a very specific customer-driven goal, as well as having a workplace where it's permissionless, and all 3 of those things tightly aligned. That in your article, there was less emphasis on the goal that of creating value for customers. It's kind of assumed, but in Tesla, I think it's very explicit. It's very I mean, could hardly be more explicit than they make. Is that not an essential piece of the permissionless corporation or not?
I think it is. Yeah, I think it is. I think you need to have an overarching reason for being. And yet, different human organizations will have different reasons for being. If you look at other companies that are very forward-looking, you've got Amazon really thinking about how do I become the company that transforms the customer experience, across all industries. And Jeff Bezos was actually quoted as citing as one of his inspirations, Rita from Sony, who basically had the mission of transforming Japan's perspective from the rest of the world as being a high quality producer. When Morita started Sony and was running it, initially Japan's manufacturing was not seen as high quality, and he viewed that as being one of his missions. Amazon said, I want to do the same thing for customer centricity. That was one of Jeff Bezos's goals. He said, if I could do for customer centricity what Morita did for quality in Japan, I think that would be pretty cool. So you do see this connection between goals and this motivation.
Right. Yeah, and I really love that section in the Harvard Business Review article about Amazon, because it sort of makes more explicit than Joe made explicit was how these algorithms get developed. And it's not like you just pick something out of the hat and that's the algorithm. And a whole process to continuously upgrade and improve the algorithm, and which doesn't really come out of as clearly, let's say, in Joe's presentation of how people vote on upvote and downvote, but there must be other thinking having gone into creating the algorithms in the first place. And I think that's made explicit in the article about Amazon, that process is described, how they actually evolve it over time. I think that's a crucial.
Well, I think one other thing that didn't come up so much with Joe, but which is sort of taken for granted in what he said, was what Amazon calls mechanisms. And so I think with normal human organizations, what happens is There's a manager, there's a person, you depend on people doing the right things. What you saw in both the Musk company case and other stories about Amazon is you see them implementing what they call mechanisms, which are around leading indicators. And so this whole conversation about, the seconds it takes to paint a car, rolling up into these other indicators, all of those things are leading indicators, which allow human groups to self-manage. And I think that's a really key concept here, which is you're not depending on a person remembering to do the right thing.
Right.
You're implementing what they call a mechanism.
Right. And the book on working backwards at Amazon stressed that their efforts to have a single formula for the performance of a team, really, they started out with that goal. It must be possible to have a single formula that we can just plug in the numbers. And as I read that book, they were saying that hadn't proved feasible, that life is too complicated, that there are many issues that come to bear, and it's a multi-dimensional thing. So you don't end up ultimately in Amazon with a single metric. You have to have multiple, at least several metrics to look at different aspects of what is going on. So that was an extremely useful way of understanding that. But in your article, you also mentioned that everything has to be different to enable this to happen. Almost everything in the organization has to be different. And you gave some examples, particularly in Fidelity, about what that looked like. Would you like to say just a word about Fidelity, how that
Sure.
took place? Yeah.
Oh, so this all started in 2014, so it's a while ago now, when Kathy Murphy basically said, we're a very ancient institution. We've been very successful. We are very successful, but she had this sense of unease that, fintechs were coming in, and she didn't feel that the organization was as customer oriented as it should be. And so the first thing she did was she commissioned an analysis of about 100 people that were working for her and just looked at what they were doing all day long. And what she found was that the average person in that 100-person group had on their plate perhaps 10 to 12 things at any given day that they were working on, and that those things were not widely shared across the organization. So the days of those people was this mess of task switching and meetings and coordination, and sometimes the right function wouldn't be brought in until way too late in the process. So engineering would come up with something, and then marketing would look at it and go, well, that's not feasible, or whatever. And so she started with an experiment, which was to say, we're going to work on these single-threaded teams. So we're going to create teams that either have or can access everything they need to complete a job. So it's going to have developers, marketers, customer success people, designers, and they're all going to be part of a team, which is small, 7 people or so, 6, 7 people. And that team is going to work on a very concretely defined single set of things for a period of, say, 2 weeks. And they did a series of experiments looking at teams that were working that way, and they found that on average, those teams were able to develop new features and functions about 75% faster than teams working in the conventional way. So this got them started. That was an experiment. That got them then started. And then eventually they converted the whole division to working that way, which is working in the agile people would know this as short sprints, where you're working on a defined set of problems, and then moving on from there. And so, as an example, one of the things that they were able to accomplish working this way was a revolution in the way that they priced access to mutual funds and EFTs. And they were able to bring younger people into the world of investing by basically eliminating fees on a whole bunch of their products. Now you can imagine the consternation of their competition. Right. So the competition's depending on making their money from these very fees that Fidelity is now proposing to eliminate entirely. But they're looking at a different metric. So what Fidelity is looking at is the lifetime value of that customer over a couple of decades, right? Whereas their competitors are looking at the transaction value or the fees on a particular product. So the way of working and the way of making money actually really connected very tightly in that example.
Yeah. And how was the change sort of received within Fidelity over time?
Well, people who benefited under the old system, people who were hierarchical managers and liked the corner office and the pot plant or whatever the perks were that went with that. Obviously, they didn't like it at all. So there was a lot of resistance. And Kathy eventually had to use a very different metric for promoting people to managerial roles. She ended up using Liz Wiseman's multipliers framework to say people that are diminishers, people that thrive on telling people what to do and having all the status and power that goes with it, those are not going to be successful in this context. So they either have to change how they behave, and if that's not possible, they have to go find themselves gainful employment somewhere else.
Yeah. I mean, we're going to be discussing tomorrow sort of how to implement some of these bold ideas, and you've indicated that it wasn't possible to do it with the existing cast of characters, that some people had to be invited to move on, in a sense. And we look at other examples like, Apple in '97 and Microsoft in 2014, that there are changes at the top have been almost, they've been quite remarkable in those transitions. Is that going to eventually be necessary for a firm to make a transition from your left-hand column to the right-hand column to get to the permissionless organization? It might not be today, it might not be tomorrow, but at some point, the cast of characters that is comfortable with the left-hand column will not be able to, some of them at least, will not be able to make the transition to the right-hand column. Is that
I think that's true with any major organizational shift. The other thing I think that's important to recognize is that this way of working, it does have its downsides, and it's not suitable for all processes, right? I don't want my pilot on my next flight suddenly deciding to do an experiment in midair. I want them to do exactly what they're supposed to do and do it routinely and with reliability every time. So I think we in management circles tend to say, okay, this is the answer and this is the answer for everything. I think there's a more nuanced version to it. And I think one of the more interesting things that the Musk companies have demonstrated is, we have this very classic distinction between exploration, which is opening up new opportunities and finding new ways of doing things, and exploitation, which is doubling down on what we already know how to do. And what I think the Musk companies are doing is they're eroding that classic distinction to some extent, because you're simultaneously uncovering new ways of doing things on an ongoing basis, while at the same time you're really exploiting what you've already learned how to do and have embedded in these algorithms. But to get to your question about, do all managers function well in all circumstances? Well, clearly not. But I think we've seen that with any major organizational change. If you've got a group of people that's been very happy and successful under a regime, and then that regime changes, oftentimes that means the people need to change.
Right. Not necessarily on day one, but as we saw in Microsoft, that a lot of that change happened before Nadella became CEO. There was a lot of preparatory work that could be done in advance of that. But we're about 6 minutes away from having to bring a close to this, but I'd like to ask the audience questions that you might have on your mind about the permissionless corporation, what we've heard today, and also in relation to what we heard on the previous session with Joe. Any questions from the group? Can't really see in the audience here. Anyone?
Hi, Rita. How are you?
Hi.
It's Miriam. I have a question. How do you begin? How do you start with the permissionless corporation? How do you begin? Where's the starting
Well, I
point?
think you have to start with where you are, right? And at Fidelity, for example, the first thing they did was they did a self-assessment. They said, well, where are we in terms of customer centricity, in terms of the goals that we want? So I think you start with just a diagnosis, right? Where are you? And then I think you start small. You start with a couple of teams that have maybe a limited objective. So let me give an example, which isn't directly permissionless, but as an example of how you begin. I think this is very valuable, which is the case of Klockner, a classic German steel and other metals distribution company, and they wanted to go digital. And they started off with this sort of internal effort, and that went nowhere. And so finally, their CEO, out of frustration, took 2 engineers and plopped them down in a sort of a workspace in Berlin, which was the Silicon Valley of Germany. And he said, look, do whatever you can, do something, do anything that makes this easier for customers to do business with, that has a digital element to it. And so the first thing that they tackled was replacing their ordering system, which at the time, believe this or not, this was 2014 or 2015. At the time, it was dependent on faxes. You know? And so they tackled the fax system first. And what was fascinating to me about that was, so you take a fax order and the fax hits the wall of the company and stuff happens behind it. And you replace the fax with the digital ordering system. Well, the digital order hits the wall of the company and it doesn't perturb anything behind it, which I think is fascinating. And so, you start with a small, concrete demonstration of something that has a high probability of success and then build from there. That's what I would suggest.
Yeah, and that's actually one of the leitmotifs of the workshop we're having here tomorrow morning is get started, do something small, pick something doable and get on the road, make it moving, not waiting for some big sort of change to come down from on high, but actually get started with this change. What else do we have from the audience? Yeah.
Can I mention one other thing, Steve, which I think is valuable to think about? We're sort of looking at the pandemic in the rearview mirror in a lot of ways. That's what I'm hearing people talk about. But we're not even through, to me, the first half of the change that the pandemic will eventually reveal to have happened. I think the repercussions are still rippling out. I mean, we're not even halfway there, in my opinion. So if we were sitting here 3 years from now and saying, wow, what's the change been since the pandemic, we would be like another order of magnitude farther on in how we think about work and how we think about organizing than we are even today.
Yeah. And will you be writing more about permissionless corporation?
I will. I'm working on a book on it, in fact.
What could you tell us about that?
About the book?
Yeah.
Yeah, well, it's really just, so it's if you think about my previous work on the nature of competitive advantage, right? You've got these short-lived, very changeable competitive advantages. And if you think about the permissionless organization, it's like, how do you deal with short-lived competitive advantages? You have to build an organization that can cope with that. And that's what I think the permissionless organization does for us.
And when will this book emerge? Can you give us any
Well, there's a discussion with my editor about whether we want it to come out during the American election season or hold it till after that. So that's an active discussion we're having at the moment.
Okay, so 2024 maybe, or maybe after?
To be determined.
To be okay, well, we're actually at the end of our unfortunately abbreviated time, and I really appreciate your patience.
Steve, one question. I think we have someone who has a question who's been waiting patiently.
In the 1 minute.
One more question, we're good.
All right, so I'll ask a super short and sweet one that probably can't get answered in a minute, but we'll give it a shot. Love the concept of permissionless organizations, but I'm curious as to how you might see that applying in a high-risk or high-safety sensitive environment.
Oh, great resource on that is Amy Edmondson's book, Right Kind of Wrong. And what you basically want is everybody in a complex system being incredibly attuned to what the risks are and really, really heightened to a sense of preventing complex systems failures.
And a final thank you for sharing these thoughts with us and being tolerant about changing schedule. And it's a real privilege to hear from someone with your expertise and just depth of understanding of these issues over so many years that you're sharing that with us. So a huge thank you from the group, if you could share your appreciation.